It's the week ending Saturday, the 20th of January, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen one of the UK's biggest government contractors go into liquidation, President Donald Trump revealing his fake news awards, and France announcing that the Bayeux Tapestry will leave the country for the first time in 950 years. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me from the Week's digital team are Kari Wilkin and Jamie Timson. And from the Week Junior, we welcome back Felicity Capon, starting the show this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Should your past remain in the past?
It's not sex and it's not work. I've worked with many, many women. I've been an activist for 23 years since I exited prostitution. And I can tell you now, I have never met a happy hooker. I've never met a woman who's empowered by prostitution. So for me, sex work it doesn't describe what it's really about. And I bet the person who coined that phrase has never, ever had to, have sex with up to 10, 15 men a day who they're certainly not choosing to be.
That was Fiona Broadfoot, who described to BBC Radio 4 this week being forced to sell sex when she was just 15 years old. Felicity, this doesn't strike me as Week Junior material, so why have you chosen it as your story of the week?
Well, this was a hearing that's gone to the High Court on Wednesday. It's been brought by a group of women who are former prostitutes who say they want to change in the law because they're being stigmatised and discriminated against. That's because their previous convictions for offences like soliciting and loitering have stayed on their record, and it means that they can't get a job working with children or vulnerable people or volunteering. And they want to change in the law so that they can move on with their lives.
OK, so this case argues, as Fiona did in that clip, that women in sex work essentially are victims, not criminals. Kari, do you agree?
Yeah, definitely. I don't think any child says, when I grow up I want to be a prostitute. It's something you're forced into either through poverty or literally forced into it, coerced into it.
Well, I mean, clearly that is often the case, but it's not exclusively the case.
No, it's not exclusively the case, but I think certainly prostitutes on the street, perhaps it's different if you're in a brothel where you're a bit more protected, although I still don't imagine it's a dream job. But on the street, it's an extremely dangerous profession, isn't it? Something like the mortality rate among prostitutes on the street, it's 12 times higher than the national average.
So this is the issue that it's soliciting that's the offence, isn't it, Felicity? So actually prostitution is legal.
Yeah,
so sort of
UK,
happy sex workers, if they exist, are more likely to be doing it on the internet, in their rooms, legal transaction, not the same if you're out on the street with a pimp, basically.
Sure, so basically the situation in the UK is that prostitution is technically legal, but there are a whole host of associated offences like loitering and soliciting, which are criminal offences. The case is interesting because it's being brought on the grounds of gender discrimination, so this is adversely affecting women rather than men. But I think the reason I chose that clip, actually, why I think that clip is so telling, is this whole difference between how we talk about prostitutes, whether we call them sex workers or whether we call them prostitutes. And the idea of sex worker is almost seen as to be more sort of women who aren't vulnerable and who have chosen to do this and should have their rights protected, but this is very much a free choice, and it's quite a sanitising sort of term. Whereas this case, I suppose, it's these women are saying that they are victims of trafficking, they are victims of abuse, and they are now having these offences sort of turned against them so that they can't now move on with their lives.
I suppose, though, Jamie, in some of these cases, you're not talking about someone who was groomed and then abused and then pimped and 20 years later is trying to get a job and they've got 1 or 2 offences. You're talking about people who might have dozens of offences. And what you're saying is if you overturn the law, that would never be made public to someone who is, hoping to employ this person as a reference to their character. There does come a point, doesn't there, where if you've got 40 offences, should they all be wiped out just because at that time, you were doing something which you argue later was against your will?
It's a very interesting question, and one that I think probably lots of different people come down on different sides. I think the idea is, and I think we're all in agreement here, that actually the women who are prostitutes shouldn't be criminalised. But there is obviously a school of thought and an argument that lots and lots of crime, people are coerced into it. If you're part of a criminal gang of some kind, generally you've been coerced into this position, and then they have to disclose I think the rule is that, as Felicity was saying, I think the rule is that if you are wanting to work with children or you have made repeat offences in the past, that has to be disclosed. But obviously, if you were coerced into being part of a criminal gang that was involved in a lot of thefts, and then 15 or 20 years later you wanted to get a job, maybe because you've been convicted twice, you then have to disclose this as a reference for your character, which has nothing to do with your character now. You know, lots of people make mistakes when they're 16 that shouldn't have an effect for the rest of their lives.
Well, this is it. And as an employer, Felicity, surely you should look at that and I don't mean you as an employer, one should be able to look at that and contextualise it. And so is the problem actually in the law that says you have to disclose any criminal convictions regardless of what they are? Or is the problem in the fact that everyone could be a bit more liberal and contextualising when looking at this evidence?
I think the problem is with the law, specifically the 1959 Street Offences Act, which makes things like loitering and soliciting an offence in the first place, because actually I don't think they ever should have been crimes, and it shows a huge lack of understanding as to, in the vast majority of cases, what these women have been subjected to. I just don't think these are crimes that an employer might have to, by law, say a woman who worked 30 years ago as a prostitute now can't work with children in the school or whatever. But actually, if you look at it on the ground, I don't see why there's any reason why they wouldn't make fantastic employees. And the sad thing is that you're forcing them probably back into prostitution, or you're disallowing them from moving on with their lives because they won't be able to find jobs to move on.
One issue with this case, it was actually initially stayed by the government because there are a series of cases concerning the disclosure of criminal convictions going through the Supreme Court at the moment. And I do just wonder if it's muddying the waters a bit to combine it with that issue of whether you should have to declare criminal convictions, whereas in fact I think perhaps more the focus should be on the fact that prostitution shouldn't be a crime to begin with, and we need to follow something more like the Nordic model, whereby it's actually the punters who are criminalised.
Because if you get onto the argument about what you should declare and what you shouldn't, one can think of other things.
Exactly.
Drugs offences,
it's
for
such
example.
a grey area, and I think that's kind of taking the focus of what the real issue is here, that prostitution shouldn't be a crime at all.
And it seems to me like that is something that is going to, if we're choosing stories that are going to define the week, it probably isn't the issue of declaring in the future, probably is the issue of prostitution, because that seems to tap into the zeitgeist, doesn't it, particularly around women's rights and understanding of sexual harassment, all the stories that have been in the news, understanding about what prostitution is and how it happens, which feels like is a debate that needs to be rehabbed.
I think it's something that's very, actually really interesting. I kind of had always, up until we looked into this topic for this podcast, been in favour, or thought I was in favour of decriminalisation. And obviously, as a man, I have no interest in telling women what they can do with their bodies and what they can and can't do. But I read an article by Julie Bindel in The Guardian where she talked about, she's an abolitionist, so she thinks that prostitution should be criminalised. I mean, obviously the women involved shouldn't be criminalised, but the people who are demanding and driving up demand for it should be prosecuted. And there should be a big push, because actually in any sex in which a transaction occurs, that's not consensual sex. So if a woman is doing it because she's getting paid, so the argument goes, that's her view, then it's not consensual. And I think what's interesting when you talk about sexual harassment in this case of kind of post-Weinstein, we are looking for people to have a really healthy view of consent. And you know, all of that stuff is saying, rather than yes, why not hell yes, I want to have sex with you in that kind of sense. And so to then accept, on that hand, then also accept that there are times when a woman who is physically repulsed by the person that she's having sex with, it's a real difficult world to live in, where we're pushing on the one hand to have consent in one case, and then on the other hand we're also saying, but this is totally okay too.
It's an interesting argument, but it's obviously contradictory, isn't it? I think often because you're talking about women, it can feel a little bit easier to say, oh yes, this is non-consensual. You know, if I as a man advertise my sexual services on the internet and someone wants to pay me for it, that clearly is consensual. I have consented to that. And if I say, I'll do this, but I won't do that, and they breach that, that's the point at which it becomes non-consensual, isn't it? Isn't that quite clear, actually? There clearly are areas where people would say, I want to meet people for sex, and that's probably not an area that the law should be getting into.
Yes, I mean, so certainly I think this isn't particularly my opinion, just the opinion of abolitionists, is the idea that actually prostitution should be seen as an act of violence in the same way that we would with rape or anything else. And the idea of women who do choose to be sex workers, I guess the argument goes that they are a very, very small minority that we probably shouldn't legislate for. In lots of ways, I agree with the sentiment that we should never legislate for a minority. We should always legislate for the majority.
What do we think, by the way, about this clip that we played about her arguing against the term sex worker? It's quite an interesting one, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I think it is, as Jamie was saying, it's really important actually that why should policy be generated on the basis of the least vulnerable women who like to call themselves sex workers and who want to see it as a job like any other, when they're usually the most vocal who get their opinions across and get into the mainstream media? Shouldn't we be legislating on the basis of so many women who don't have any sort of real meaningful choice about whether they're going into prostitution, women who are trafficked, who I think more people would talk about as victims or prostitutes?
I suppose the problem is we haven't got another word to use apart from prostitute, which itself was loaded, which is why people started using sex working, but I guess ultimately that will work itself out. Jamie, you are up next this week. What do you think the week will be remembered for?
Was this the week that history repeated itself again?
For the Serbian state, this is an act of terrorism, and we will address it accordingly. We request that Serbian authorities participate in the investigation process on the territory of Kosovo. We are convinced that our participation would mean finding out the truth behind the assassination of Oliver Ivanović.
That was Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić speaking to the press this week after politician Oliver Ivanović was shot dead in Kosovo. So Jamie, last week you brought us Northern Ireland, this week Serbia. You're now our sectarian specialist correspondent. Why do you think we should be paying more attention to this story?
There's problems everywhere.
There are.
First of all, we probably should go back and do a very small history lesson, as I did with Northern Ireland last week, just to bring people up to speed. Kosovo...
Timson Pocket Guide.
Yeah. Kosovo is a Albanian majority province. It is a disputed territory, so 112 countries recognise it as its own separate country. I think there are 5 major nations that don't, of which Russia and obviously Serbia is one. We best know it in Britain as being one of probably Tony Blair's wars that he can look back on with fondness, considering that it kind of had quite a good ending in terms of his ideas. We went in, we stopped Slobodan Milosevic, we organised what did become an independent state and gave ethnic Albanians their own state within Serbia.
And so what happened this week?
So this week there was an assassination of a Serbian Kosovan politician called Oliver Ivanović. He is seen as being a moderate, basically, he had a lot of enemies. He was initially a kind of a supporter of the Serbian minority. So Kosovo is divided in 2 by a river, and in the north is where all of the Serbs now live, and the south is the rest of Kosovo, which is all ethnic Albanians. The north is widely regarded at the moment to be quite a lawless region. The government in Pristina, the Kosovan capital, doesn't have much to do with the north, with the Serbs, obviously because of the tensions. But he was seen as a moderate because he was actually quite vocally against the Serbian government, who obviously don't recognise Kosovo as its own state, still think of Kosovo as being part of Serbia. But he also angered Albanians because in 2014 he was convicted of war crimes of killing ethnic Albanians in 1999. The verdict was annulled 2 years later in 2016, and he finally came out of jail just a few months ago. And a retrial was pending when he was killed.
Okay, but this is significant. Why? Are you basically saying it hasn't gone away?
So the problem with the Balkans is that it's an incredibly fragile state. I think it was the Bulgarian Prime Minister that said this week, when he was talking about the assassination, he said, "You saw what happened yesterday, just one bullet and the situation changed dramatically. The Balkans are a very fragile construction, and if it starts shaking, the whole of Europe will start shaking."
I mean, it is kind of extraordinary, isn't it, that we have this situation where a moderate, as you were saying, Jamie, or a politician who's perceived to be moderate, effectively assassinated, a kind of mafia-style assassination on a front door in the street in a country that the EU recognises, that Britain recognises, and it doesn't get a lot of news traction.
I think part of the problem is it's quite a complicated situation and people don't necessarily understand what's going on over there, but it's definitely headline news, or it should be. I mean, the Kosovo president, Hashim Thaki, he's facing accusations that he's led an organised crime network. And as you say, in a European nation, it's extraordinary that that's not getting more coverage.
Why do you think that is? I mean, why do you think it is that we don't understand more about Kosovo?
Well, it is just incredibly complicated when you look at the last few decades, what countries have gone where since it was Yugoslavia. It is an incredibly complicated jigsaw puzzle to work it out now. But I think actually what's important about this is that many observers saw 2018 as a really important year in mending relations between Serbia and its former southern province. And so that's why it's all more of a shame that this has happened and could plunge the whole region back into turmoil, because, there was hopes that there were going to be, the EU was going to sort of broker peace talks between the two sides. I think Serbia is very aware that the only way it can become a member of the EU is if it recognises Kosovo in some way. So
they were actually at peace talks, weren't they, when the news came through that in Brussels, that when the news came through that he'd been assassinated.
And what's the EU done about this?
Not a great deal so far.
They don't have much that they can do. Their only carrot, as it were, to Serbia to recognise Kosovo is to let them in on the EU. Just 3 days before he was assassinated, the Bosnian president said that Russian paramilitary were training military organisations in the north of Kosovo, in the Serbian ethnic, in order to really kind of mess things up. This is part of a more wider geopolitical tension between Russia and the EU.
Well, this is it, isn't it? And if you've got Putin and I guess Trump as well going to start wading in on this, it's sort of quite important the EU gets a handle on it and says, no, this is what we think should happen first.
I think this is actually part of the reason as well why this isn't getting more coverage, is that Eastern Europe is often viewed as quite separate from the rest of Europe. It's more of Russian satellite states, and obviously Russia wants to prevent Kosovo from getting into the EU because then they lose that sort of leverage that they have over them.
I think it just shows the kind of the depressing nature of Britain at the moment. The fact that in the mid-90s, we're talking about 20 years ago, we played a really huge role in helping people to safety in the Balkans, in a place that people are so willing to go on holiday to. Who has been to Croatia recently? And it's like, oh, this is beautiful. What an amazing place. What an amazing country. And yet these things are happening and we don't care about it enough, or we don't know enough about it, or we're avoiding it. But we're very happy to take the cheap flights to go there and experience the culture and everything.
I mean, is that partly because of the other problems that are going on in the EU at the moment? Obviously Brexit with regards to Britain, but I guess also, the immigration crisis and the people that are coming into Britain from across the Mediterranean Sea. It's sort of like if we intervene too strongly there, then it's yet another thing that, Britain becomes involved in Europe when we are clearly ignoring other problems.
I think that way madness lies in a sense of closing off our minds to the issues. And I think that's a real problem with the inward thinking since Brexit, is that if we're too afraid to intervene in things, if we kind of say, oh no, we can't do this because of the knock-on effect that it'll have, because Christ, Germany took in 1 million people and we just didn't take anywhere near the same amount. So they are having a much bigger problem, as it were, if there is a problem with the flow of migrants and all of that.
No, but exactly, we didn't. So then wouldn't it seem hypocritical to suddenly wade into Kosovo?
Why would we intervene? I don't understand why we would intervene in Kosovo.
But just to take a stronger hand,
be more proactive is basically what you mean.
Yeah, diplomatically. No, I don't mean intervening as in people on the ground or anything. But we have really abdicated our responsibility since the 90s in the Balkans. We sorted it out in our mind, through things like Tony Blair, and then we've taken a step back and allowed people like Putin to have a stronger say in what's going on there.
We sorted it out through things like Tony Blair. Finally, this week, it's Kari. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
What happened to Martin Luther King's dream?
The fact is that schools, particularly in the North, are more segregated today than they were in 1954 when the Supreme Court rendered its decision outlawing segregation. These are the hard facts. And we can't sit on our stools of do-nothingism and not try to solve these problems. We've got to rise up. We've got to organize. We've got to mobilize. And we've got to work to solve these problems.
A sermon by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. from 1967, recorded by KPIX Eyewitness News. Kari, this week was Martin Luther King Day in the US, wasn't it? And he predicted it would take 90 years or so to integrate schools in America. How has that been going?
Not brilliantly. A new report by the US Commission on Civil Rights says that segregation and inequality persist in US schools and in fact is getting worse. Students of colour are living in poor segregated neighbourhoods and they're often relegated to low quality schools simply due to where they live.
Okay, let's just investigate that term though. I mean, by segregation, when you're talking about by colour in the USA, we're not talking about, unofficial return to the 1950s, are we? Technically, schools are available for black and white children to go to together, right?
Technically, but in terms of actual ethnic segregation, the situation now isn't much better than it was in the 60s. There was a lot of progress made, particularly after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But since about the 1980s, those gains have effectively been erased for a variety of reasons.
But I mean, it's the case here, isn't it? In Britain and other
Britain's
countries,
not
that
much better.
Inner city schools, for example, are more likely to have ethnic minorities in them. And it's the case in America that poorer areas are more likely to have black children in them.
It's a different situation in the US when it comes to African Americans because of it's not a return so much as a continuation, because actually this goes back to decades of racist housing policy at all different levels that have meant that they've just become ingrained, and that's just the way it is. And even though you don't have de jure segregation, you have equally, it's not de facto segregation either. It's not a coincidence that, black Americans are living where they are. Whereas I think in this country, for example, you might see, due to patterns of immigration, you might see people living together based on the language they speak or things like that. But I think it's a very different case in the US, which is deeply ingrained within their history.
And I think segregation's been revived through a series of recent decisions by the US judiciary. And the Trump administration, again, it's getting worse. It's getting noticeably worse. He's slashed education funding by $9.2 billion in his first budget. And obviously that is massively going to affect the poorer neighbourhoods.
And the other issue as well is the way that state schools in America are funded, right, Jamie? So here in the UK, obviously, state schools have a contribution from the local council, but they effectively all get the same amount, whereas in the States it is by state, it's not federal.
Yeah, and choice is really down to how much the state thinks that it can afford to give to schools, which obviously means that in places like Mississippi, which are the poorest of states, that can barely struggle to afford to feed the people that live there, they end up with less money going into education. I think the thing is it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're a poor African American and you go to a school which has obviously less funding because there is less money going into it, you basically have far less opportunity to move out of that world and I think that one of the answers is the idea of desegregation and setting up new schools that do mix, but
new funding models as well within states.
Yeah, I also read that school funding is largely determined by property tax revenues. So in areas where you have very wealthy white neighbourhoods, it follows that there are going to be more money for schools, and that's why the statistics are so widely out, particularly when it comes to kids going on to high school and college.
Exactly, it perpetuates inequality, and the Trump administration actually they're expanding the private school voucher system, whereby basically parents get a subsidy to put children in private schools.
It's hard,
but obviously only richer parents can afford. Richer, typically white parents, can afford to do so.
But then the point of capitalism is to perpetuate inequality, isn't it? I mean, that's the thing. You can have charity that helps poorer people, but if you subscribe to the idea that everyone's just trying to make as much money as possible, then gentrification happens. People move to areas where other people are as wealthy as them. They want to do that. That's the American dream. And then they don't want to be sending their kids to mixed school.
That's the thing, is that it's hard to persuade people when it's to do with their children that actually equality is...
Yeah,
let's experiment. Let's send them to the mixed school because that's fairer for society. And they're like, well, I don't want to... My children aren't going to be worth experimenting.
I've worked hard so they can go.
People are much more likely to make moral compromises when it's their children. That's when people's morality goes out the window.
And so I don't know what you do unless you have state forcing desegregation and stopping... Because the way it works is that these small white rich communities set up their own school boards and set up their own school communities to be able to just create segregation just through themselves. I don't know what you do without.
But my point is, of all countries, that is not going to happen in the United States of America, is it? Or am I wrong? Is this story coming up, Kari, because there's been some groundswell of opinion that something needs to change?
Like I said, the US Commission on Civil Rights, they've had this new report which has got a lot of attention in America, I think, regarding Trump's recent comments about shithole countries. Raised the issue, put that back in the spotlight.
Yes.
It's not going to change because there's still massive racism in the US. Surely that's like the kind of thing we're beating around the bush here, and it kind of extends to all different aspects of society. It made me think of the Netflix documentary 13th. I don't know if anyone's seen it, but it's brilliant, and it talks about the 13th Amendment actually including a very important loophole that said, yes, we abolish slavery for everyone except criminals. And in some way, I think that really resonates, the idea that US prisons are the new plantations, the idea that there are so many aspects of slavery and Jim Crow and segregation and a massive hangover that just hasn't gone away at all. I think we're really kidding ourselves to say that it has.
And,
it doesn't surprise me at all there's still massive segregation.
LeBron James said this week, he spoke out against Donald Trump and he said, I always knew that racism existed in this country, but his presidency has given a voice. It's given a voice to the racists and given a legitimacy to that. And that was... There
is, though, in the grown-up world in America, just leaving children aside for a moment, there is a different way of genuinely celebrating diversity. I agree, there is racism in America, but even within the ethnic groups that are concerned within that, there is a feeling of celebration of, I wouldn't go as far to call it segregation, but you walk around town and it's very clear, this is the Latin Quarter, this is the Jewish area, this is Chinatown. And actually American cities are organised in a way that those communities are proud of those areas, in a way that we're not in Western Europe. And so it might be harder to necessarily relate to that as, for some of those communities, a positive thing.
That doesn't excuse the lack of funding, though, for the minority schools.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, and you can be proud of your neighbourhood.
But what I mean is it's endemic. What you're saying is, let's change the way that American society works. Let's stop pretending it's not racist. But actually, for a lot of American cities, they like the fact this is where the Irish ones live and this is where the Chinese ones live. I
don't think this problem is limited to America. Sweden's having a similar problem with school segregation. It's massively increasing there because since they've introduced a similar schools voucher system, but also, there's been a major increase in immigration, and it's seen a major growth in racism.
I think what you're saying, Olly, and is interesting, is throws up the question of that idea of multiculturalism and, being a nation of immigrants and that idea of whether actually what we want from society is that everyone stays in their own pockets and, you have the Jewish quarter and you have the Latin quarter, and actually whether that promotes racism in a way because it's like, oh, well, so this is where all of these people live and we're going to let them do that. Multiculturalism, that's what we're really about. That's what we're a big fan of. But we're going to let them have their space. And then suddenly it's like, oh, no, I don't go there.
That paradoxically, those residential pockets that create the segregated schools, it's actually the perfect way to target that is through more mixed schools. It's not going to get any better. It's just going to keep looping round.
I don't recall Martin Luther King saying that. I think we've got 40 years left, haven't we, until we see equality in schools. He said 90 years, 50 years ago.
Yeah, something like that. Although he was basing it on the current rate of change at that point, and we're a long way off it if based on that.
Well, good to end on a laugh. That's it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. Thank you, Kari Wilkin, Jamie Timson and Felicity Capon. For more from us at The Week, why not visit theweek.co.uk. You can also sign up there to our free email newsletter, The Weekday, or of course, and I encourage you to do this, you can have our excellent magazine delivered direct to your door. Just head to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. There's The Week Junior as well, of course. All our past episodes are available on our podcast feed. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.